Welcome to the Unique History Channel. Today, we'll be reading from The History of Central America, Chapter 4, Panama from Colombian Province to an Occupied State. As had been the case in the prehistoric and colonial eras, Panama followed its own path to independence, autonomy, and development during the 19th and 20th centuries. The size of Panama's coffee crop and its export economy generally pales in comparison to other Central American countries. Conversely, for better or worse, its link to the developing world economy in the 19th and 20th centuries exceeded that of any other country because of its strategic location, its exportable raw materials, which was its location. Cacao, indigo, and other coffee economies suffered occasionally at the hands of rural demand, but passage from sea to sea via the shortest route never fell out of season. As long as the politicians and merchants needed to get from one ocean to another as quickly and as safely as possible, a market would always exist for Panama's greatest raw material. On November 28th, 31 of Panama's leading landowners and merchants convened to declare their independence from Spain. Ill-equipped to defend themselves from Spanish reprisals, these leading citizens annexed the isthmus to Simón Bolívar's Gran Colombia, a newly established entity in which Panama's elite had much in common. Wealthy merchants in Panama City and Bogotá shared common interests in secure trade across Panama, and this alliance met concerns Panama would generate for Colombia a large amount of revenue as the principal port of transport between the oceans. Meanwhile, residents of Panama City and Portobelo would service those transshipments, making a fortune in their monopoly of the shipping industry. Merchants in Panama quickly realized that their alliance with Bogotá left them vulnerable to exploitation, so as they watched the large portion of money earned in Panama sent to merchants and officials in Bogotá. Just as Guatemalans had quickly wearied of their subordinate relationship with Mexico, Panamanian merchants soon came to resent the subordinate officials and banks in distant Bogotá. A popular conscience. Early relationships between Panama City and Bogotá proved cumbersome and divisive. Officials in Bogotá had allowed wealthy merchants in Panama to trade freely with the friendly nations, but this attempt by Bogotá overlooked the race and class compositions of Colombia's northern countryside. Much of Colombia's restive Caribbean coast was black African, as well as urban Panama. Bogotá's generosity with Panama's tiny merchant elite excluded the region's large population of black urban poor. These attempts by Colombian officials at placating Panama's small white merchant population seriously alienated blacks in Gran Colombia's northern reaches, including Panama. The race problems were further exacerbated when Bolívar and his appointees based suffrage on property requirements, land ownership, thus disenfranchising most of Panama's black population, which formed a part of Colombia's black liberals, those blacks who favored racial equality, states' rights, and laissez-faire economics. Thus, early in Panama's history, a popular class conscience emerged, with Panama's large black population recoiling against its subservience to whites. In 1830, the first tangible evidence of this popular class conscience was surfaced when mulatto José Domingo Espinar began a separatist movement among the urban poor in Panama City. Espinar, formerly Simón Bolívar's personal secretary, used his political experience to fashion Panama City's urban masses into a formidable, well-organized group with common goals. Espinar's separatist movement actually achieved control of Panama City for several months in 1830, while Colombian officials and white Panamanians reeled, declaring Panama's independence from Colombia September 26th of that year. Whites in Panama feared a repeat of the slave uprising that had occurred in Haiti at the turn of the century, and they took steps to regain control of the situation. Conservative government José de Obadiah went as far as accusing Espinar of organizing a caste war against Panama's white population. Espinar's response proved more enduring than the separatist movement, which soon crushed. Espinar responded that the government must have recently gone a profound organic alteration of the brain. Espinar's uprising underscores a polarity of Panama's political situation at the time. Elsewhere in Spanish America, ownership of the means of production afforded the governing elite a mechanicism of control when things got out of hand. When threatened, Cochitial barons in Guatemala, for example, used their control of peasant livelihoods as a means of coercion. Particularly through the region of Catajer, landowners used their control of land as a negotiating mechanism to achieve their bargaining objectives. Elites in Panama had no such mechanism of leverage. When threatened by espionage, Panama's ruling elite had to choose between two unpalatable options: be governed by a separatist movement composed of largely angry black poor, or ask Colombian troops to intervene and save them. Panama's wealthy chose to ask Colombian troops for help, and in late 1831, Colombian colonel Juan Iligo Aluzuru ended espionage rebellions and restored Colombian control. For the first time in Panama's history, its governing elite had asked foreign troops to intervene on their behalf. Given their unique predicament, they did not own the means of local livelihood. Panama's city elite used the only mechanism of leverage at their disposal: foreign military intervention. This scene would repeat itself more than 24 times over the next 2 centuries, culminating a massive invasion by the American military forces in December 1989 that left thousands dead and homeless. Federalism. A second problem emerged shortly after independence from Spain that similarly strained Panama's ties to Bogota. By the mid-19th century, much of Panama's wealthy worked in the transportation industry, providing warehousing needs to merchants transshipping goods across the isthmus. Many of these same wealthy owned urban properties that they rented to people crossing the isthmus, helping them along their way. Over time, these urban wealthy increasingly resented the taxes and tariffs they were required to send to Bogota. The nationalist activists agitated increasingly against Colombian and foreign intervention. By the mid-1850s, one of the most visible of these middle-class activists, Justo Arosemena, became the most vocal advocate for Panama's independence from Colombia. Arosemena believed that Panama would become an emporium of world commerce, and he opposed quite vocally Colombia's political and economic jurisdiction on the isthmus. He contended correctly that the Bogota siphoned off a huge sum of money in the form of taxes that ought to remain in Panama. He argued for an autonomous Panamanian government that would administer isthmus's economic and legal affairs, while helping profits from Panama's transportation industry in Panama. In 1855, the United States finished constructing the Panama Railway. The next year, Arosemena argued against Yankee intervention. He clamored against Colombian intervention. For the first time, anti-Americanism became political currency on the isthmus, a process accelerated by reaffirmed by Washington's repeated military invasions of Panama through the next 150 years. A false sense of prosperity. Under the Bourbon reforms of the 18th century, Spain had increased its number of ports, while the merchants could legally trade with Spanish America. This removed Panama's monopoly on the trade between the Andes and Europe, and the amount of commerce crossing the isthmus declined precipitously. With little compelling them to return to Panama City, much of isthmus' tiny elite moved to their ranches deep in Panama's interior, where they maintained a small but flourishing cattle industry. Events in the first decades of the 19th century reversed the out-migration triggered by the Bourbon policies. The discovery of gold along the California coast had helped spur the completion of the Panama Railroad, which, completed in 1855, facilitated safe, rapid transit for 49ers rushing to stake their claim. A combination of the gold rush and the completed railway drew increasing numbers of wealthy Hispanics back to the city, where they again invested heavily in the transit industry. Wealthy Panamanians assumed second-tier administration posts within the railroad while investing heavily in rental properties, related service sector businesses such as warehouses. The initial economic flurry triggered by the 49ers sparked what one Panamanian scholar has called a false sense of prosperity. Rental prices spiked as demand soared. capitalizing on a housing frenzy among the urban elite who rushed to capitalize on large waves of foreigners crossing Panama en route to the coast of North America. The boom triggered a gold rush profoundly affected life in Panama. Thousands of Afro-West Indians had gone to Panama to help build the railroad, and on its completion, many lacked the resources necessary to return to their homelands, remaining instead in Panama. This large population of unemployed railroad laborers joined the many hundreds of oarsmen, mule train drivers put permanently out of work by completion of the railroad. Panama's wealthy fared little better. For several years after the completion of the railroad, waves of prospectors continued to flood across Panama. As the gold rush tapered off, however, so did the demands for Panama's expedited service economy. British and American financiers had invested in the railroad, and its rail-related industries continued to make money once prospector traffic stopped. Despite the cessation of the gold frenzy, the railroad continued to offer travelers a safer and easier journey from coast to coast. Conversely, Panamanian capital has been invested entirely in housing and service industries, which has dried up once again. California's gold veins ceased producing windfall fortunes. As being the case when Bourbon reforms had ended in Panama's monopoly on commerce between Europe and the Andes, Panama's economic elite once again found themselves struggling to survive yet another change in world commerce. Circumstances surrounding the completion of the railroad and its end of the gold rush frayed race and class relations on the isthmus. The railroad also strained Panama's city relations with Bogotá. Railroad officials paid Colombia $250,000 a year for land and necessary rights to operate their railroad, but Bogotá only sent $225,000 that money back to Panama. Panama's albatross was Colombia's cash cow. The limits of liberalism. The 1850s and 1860s proved a hard, heady time for Colombia. Coffee prices were high, as were returns on the Colombian cash crops, indigo, tobacco, and rubber. As had been the case in Guatemala during the Carrera regime, a strong economy placated all concerned, including both wealthy investors and peasant laborers. Circumstances during good economic times required minimal oversight, and at the end, liberals in Bogotá acted a liberal constitution that significantly reduced Colombia's military and administration presence throughout the countryside, including in Panama. During this time of economic windfall, the liberalization made sense. The new government's reduced presence, improved relations with its rural provinces, were more jobs and higher wages, accomplished what required rifles and soldiers during times of economic duress. By pushing states' rights so empathetically, though, Bogotá significantly reduced its ability to govern the hinterlands, particularly the northern coastal regions of Bolívar, Macmillan, and Panama. Circumstances would underscore the limits of liberalism. 2. Decades later, when world markets constricted and prices fell sharply. The Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique, the Universal Company of the Interoceanic Canal. For wealthy Panamanians in the 1870s, Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps seemed an act of providence. De Lesseps began digging the Suez Canal in 1857, despite widespread desertion from what many considered a silly idea. Yet in 1869, de Lesseps' seemingly impossible dream came true, when the Suez Canal opened for business. After several decades, de Lesseps studied world commerce and concluded that he needed to build a second great waterway, this one through Panama. In 1879, de Lesseps pitched his proposal at an international conference in Paris. The majority of the conference participants embraced the concept of the Panama Canal and named de Lesseps the leader of the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique. De Lesseps had never been to Panama and was not an engineer, and when the Paris conference began, a French engineer named Gaudin de Lépinay called de Lesseps' plan for a sea-level canal across Panama suicidal, and instead promotes a canal and lock system that closely reflected the American plan that succeeded a few decades later. De Lesseps' plan for a sea-level canal carried the day, and the Compagnie began planning on how best to accomplish this monumental task. Panama's wealthy hoped that the French Canal would breathe new life into their economy, and they were not disappointed. The influx of thousands of French citizens during the project, 1881 to 1889, temporarily resuscitated Panama's morbid economy. Two things happened in the 1880s, though, that upset the relativeness of equilibrium. First, the French were failing in their attempt to master Panama's difficult terrain, and second, economic realities elsewhere in Colombia had turned sour in the mid-1880s, and conservatives were now moving to both control economic difficulties in Colombia, faced unrest caused by those difficulties. Rafael Núñez and Colombia's relegation. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, sharp declines in world demand for coffee, indigo, rubber, tobacco dramatically reversed the giddy economic trends of the 1860s. Among Colombia's laborers, these changes meant fewer jobs and lower wages. Unemployment rose, dissatisfaction increased, and strikes once again became prominent as workers' nerves and patience became frayed. Yet the 1863 Constitution had severely limited Bogotá's ability to quell the violence and restore order. Into this set of circumstances stepped Rafael Núñez, one of the more colorful politicians anywhere in the Americas. Rafael Núñez began his political career as a radical liberal who supported the 1863 Constitution and supported states' rights. And then, for more than a decade, he served as a Colombian diplomat in Europe, where he devoted considerable time to studying European political and economic thought. When he returned to Colombia in 1875, Núñez became convinced that Colombia needed a restoration of conservative values. As he witnessed the effects of the market stagnation on Colombia's economy and stability, he became convinced the only way to promote progress and order was to reconstitute the conservative centralized state that had dominated Colombia during the first decades of independence. Núñez believed that a strong military, a strong federal police force, to be the only means of accomplishing this objective. In 1880, he ascended to the presidency of the Colombia and began sweeping reforms aimed at restoring the national government's prestige and ability to govern. Elected again in 1884, Núñez launched La Restoration, a series of conservative steps aimed at undoing the reforms of the 1860s, and among other things, Núñez Restoration announced that the 1863 Constitution ceased to exist, proposed and enacted a new constitution in 1886, which replaced state governors with new state governors appointed by the president, extended presidential terms to 6 years, based suffrage on literacy and property requirements, made Catholicism Colombia's official religion, restored several clergy privileges removed by liberals, including maintaining all education in all levels of Colombia being made to conform with Catholic doctrine. This last point has been significant among Colombians. At a time when Jeremy Bentham and other liberal authors promoted secular education and roundly rejected creationism, Núñez's decision to give the church control of education granted priests veto power over textbooks they deemed objectionable. La Regeneration ensured that secularism would not form part of any level in Colombia. Núñez ruled Colombia in a fashion until his death in 1894. His progressive dictatorship had many similarities to Guatemala's own Reforma, shredding priorities of Barrios. His policies favored the rich at the expense of the poor, and La Regeneration alienated millions of Colombian people. The 1,000 Days Wars and Panama's independence. For these and other reasons, La Regeneration forms an integral part of Panamanian history. Just as the French Canal fleet was taking off, and Panama's urban elites once again began seeing returns on their urban real estate investments, Colombia returned to heavy-handed means of administrating Panama. Núñez alienated Panama's elites when he increased taxes and implemented forced loans to government, and returned to the practice of placing custom houses in Panama, a practice that had been outlawed in March 1835. He disenfranchised Panama's poor by basing suffrage on literacy and property qualifications, thus ending universal male suffrage on the Isthmus. While the French moved forward, most Panamanians remained plasticated, poor at jobs, and the rich had money to pay the elevated taxes demanded by Bogota. The benefits they received from the French outweighed the resentment of the Bogotano insurrection. The failure of the Sleep's project, however, had the same effect on Panamanians as declining coffee prices had on residents elsewhere in Central America. The elite began considering their options in the face of Núñez's heavy-handedness, and the protests of urban poor reached a crescendo in the mid-1880s. Living conditions among Panama's city's working poor were deplorable long before the Rendición began, and Núñez's tax reforms and vagrancy laws pushed life in the Panama City urban poor to the crisis stage. Under these conditions, in early 1885, two mulatto leaders, Rafael Arabuz and Pedro Preston, took matters in their own hands. Apparently functioning independently of one another, Ayesburo and Preston took control of Panama and Colón with the support of the working-class populations of both cities. They controlled the city for several months, but after a now-established pattern of response, Panama's elites requested armed resistance from Colombia and the United States. Colombian troops, with the support of 1,200 troops, found their way into two cities, ended the uprising. In August, Pesson was publicly hanged in the ad hoc gallows in Colón, signaling a violent end to yet another uprising among Panama's large urban working class. By 1890, conditions in Panama had degenerated dangerously. In 1885, the urban poor had seen their protests violently subdued, and in 1888, the French Canal project collapsed once again, creating tens of thousands unemployed foreign black workers. Also, Panama's merchant class and economic elite found their hopes once again dashed of their fortunes jeopardized by a failed foreign economic initiative on the Isthmus. Independence. Núñez's regeneration helped only a small portion of Colombia's population. Political and financial elites, wealthy merchants, and foreigners wishing to do business in Colombia. His financial policies profoundly affected the nation's poor. However, when they began for clamoring chains, he reverted to violence. Núñez made the national police a permanent institution and enacted laws that gave military monopoly for the use of force in Colombia. His 1886 constitution reserved for the central government the exclusion to bear arms and ammunition. Any resistance to these policies would be thwarted violently, and he ensured that any battle with his troops would not be a fair fight. Under these circumstances, peasants throughout rural Colombia began resisting these reforms. Protests erupted throughout the countryside, including Panama, and after Núñez's death in 1894, the clash continued, culminating in 1899 with the outbreak of a bloody three-year civil war known as the Guerra de los Mil Días, the 1,000 Days War, 1899 to 1902. This war cost Colombia 100,000 lives and vast economic destruction. At the height of the 1,000 Days War, Panamanian nationalists, led by Belisario Porras, took up an armed attempt to permanently expel Colombian troops from Panama. From July 1900 to October 1902, these nationalists fought tenuously to drive Colombians from Panama. In October 1902, Porras' insurgent forces abandoned their efforts and surrendered, effectively ending the conflict. With this peace accord effectively ended, pitched the battles around the capital city. Many of Panama's rural poor objected to Porras' decision to capitulate and continued fighting. Most notably with the brother of the rural rovers was Victoriano Lorenzo, a Guame Indian from the Coleche in north-central Panama. Lorenzo refused to surrender his weapons when the peace accord was signed, and he continued to lead an effective guerrilla insurgency against Colombian soldiers and against other comrades who had capitulated in a peace treaty. Lorenzo's continued resistance epitomized the division between poor Panamanians in rural areas and urban Panamanians who stood to gain from foreign commerce transmitting during the Isthmus. Porras and his urban middle-class followers had fought for control of Panama's commercial sector. Lorenzo and his guerrilla fighters had fought for Panama's independence and their expulsion of foreigners from the Isthmus, including foreigners who had gone to Panama to seek their fortunes. In tragic German events, an armed group consisting of Colombian troops and Panamanian nationals arrested Lorenzo and took him to Panama City, where they charged him with inciting insurgency and threatening the stability of the government. On May 15, 1903, Lorenzo was executed by hanging, murdered by a group that included many Panamanians. Lorenzo's death became a rallying point for all Panamanians opposed to foreign encroachment and elite manipulation. Understandably, he became a martyred hero of the nationalist crusade. In December 1901, the United States and Great Britain had signed the Huey-Ponce-Fonte Treaty, an agreement wherein Great Britain ceded to Washington the right to build and control a canal across Central America. In the wake of the Spanish-American War, President Theodore Roosevelt believed that a small canal across Central America to be a crucial fortune to American security. In 1902, the Spooner Bill mandated Panama to be the site of the unfolding of the American Canal Project. In the Hay-Hedon Treaty of 1903, Colombia consented to give Washington a 100-year lease to build and operate a canal across Panama, and plans for the American Canal Project seemed to be approaching fruition. The Colombian legislature never ratified the Hay-Hedon Agreement, and however, by mid-1903, Bogota's opposition to the accord became clear. In July 1903, a revolutionary junta comprised of prominent Panamanians began lobbying for an American intervention. This group of wealthy Panamanians, headed by Dr. Manuel Amor Guerrero, wanted the United States to complete the canal project, left behind by the French, and at this point Washington clearly wanted to undertake the project, so neither side began much cajoling. Theodore Roosevelt was infuriated by Colombians' foot-dragging, and quickly embraced the ideal proposed by Guerrero and his supporters. Beginning in 1903, Panamanian Revolutionary Junta began agitating against Colombian officials in Panama. Then, when the support of the United States, the junta declared Panama's independence with support of the United States from Colombia on November 3, 1903. Colombia's ability to defend its sovereign interests in Panama were badly hampered by the presence of the American battleship USS Nashville. In a stunning display of gunboat diplomacy, U.S. forces prevented Colombian troops from landing. In absence of Colombian troops thwart the uprising, the insurgency succeeded with amazing rapidity and the minimum of bloodshed. The revolt was over in one day, with 1 dead and minimal destruction. In gaining their independence, insurgent leaders moved to quickly bolster the new nation. Insurgency was eerily similar to Panama's independence from Spain in 1821. Guerrero and his compatriots looked to Washington to replace Colombia as the patron of Panamanian independence. The Revolutionary Junta appointed Frenchman Philippe Bonne-Villa as their economic representative to Washington. Bonne-Villa, who had invested heavily in the French canal system, stood to recover a significant amount of money if the United States moved ahead with its plans for a canal in Panama. In the months before Panama's independence, Bonne-Villa helped arrange financial support for the insurgents. In return for the support, the junta appointed him their diplomatic representative to Washington and instructed him not to sign any agreements until Guerrero and his entourage arrived later. Bonne-Villa's appointment is the defining crucible in modern Panamanian history. Instead of honoring his appointment, the Frenchman disregarded this diplomatic change and signed a treaty with Secretary of State John Hay that completed disregard for Panamanian interests. In exchange for the $10 million sale of the project to the French to the Americans, Bonne-Villa agreed to the Canal Treaty with the United States. It granted Washington a 10-mile wide strip of land between Panama City and Colon, Panama's premier commercial real estate. Worse still, he granted the U.S. government foreign sovereign control of the Peace Prime real estate in perpetuity forever. When Amador died and arrived in Washington train station, he was greeted by Bonne-Villa, who informed him of the agreement. Devastated, Amador slapped the Frenchman's cheek with the club. This was indeed done. However, Panamanians could do nothing reverse to the agreement. Completed on November 18, 1903, the Hay-Bonavilla Treaty formed the nucleus of anti-Americanism in Panama and through much of Latin America for the duration of the 20th century. Two facets of the accord understandably generations of Panamanians. First, Bonavilla's treasonous act ensured that no Panamanian could represent to the signing objected the conditions of the agreement. Secondly, the United States exploited the revealed treaty while completely disregarding the sovereignty of the new republic. Under these conditions, Panama had been the 20th century as it had been the 19th, as well as every century since the Europeans arrived, beholden to a foreign country that maintained a large military presence on the isthmus since the early 16th century. Panama had occupied by foreigners, intent on exploiting Panama and quite willing to use violence if Panamanians objected too strenuously. Occupation and perpetuity. The United States began constructing the Panama Canal in 1904 and successfully completed it in 1914 as war erupted in Europe. Now open to the world commerce, the canal cut 8,000 nautical miles off the trip between the east and the west coast of the United States. Traffic began slowly, but over time a large percentage of the world's commerce took advantage of the shortcut. Tactically, the canal enabled U.S. war planners to move ships and armaments between oceans with minimum time and expense. For politicians, the strategic value of the canal made Panama one of the most important spots on the globe for defense of the United States. Throughout World War II, the U.S. military and State Department considered Panama and Hawaii two of the most significant spots in the world outside the United States. Disruption and intervention. During the construction of the canal, the United States imported thousands of laborers from the U.S., West Indies, and other countries, further exacerbating the problems among Panama's urban poor. Panamanian landowners charged workers what they could get away with, and when workers rebelled, canal officials worked with Panamanian police to quell the uprising. 3 monumental renter strikes, 1920, 1925, and 1932, accentuated the tearing relationships existed between wealthy Panamanians, their American patrons, and Panama's working poor. Deja vu. The construction of the Panama Canal resulted in large presence of foreign troops to occupy Panamanian soil. In a broader sense, however, the canal did not change the relationship between Panama's elites and its foreign patron. After independence, Amador instituted an academic police force whose principal responsibility was election rigging, intimidating liberals during elections. As one American observer noted in 1906, explicit directions have been given to the police to prevent by every means in their power the success of liberals who in a fair election would overthrow the Amador government by 100 to 1. Conservatives intended a new police force to serve as a emergence of political intimidation and little else. After protests got out of hand, the administration of President that same year, American troops traveled to Panama's frontier province of Turkey to quell political unrest there, demonstrating a shocking willingness to project the threat of military force anywhere in the Republic. The early years of the 20th century accentuate all too clearly the degree in which Panama's early presidents depended on foreign intervention for legitimacy. These early years also demonstrate the depths to which Panama's early politicians would stoop to remain in power, from asking foreign troops to forcibly intervene using Panamanian police to rig election results. These practices continued largely uninhabited throughout the 20th century. Likewise, the agreements of tens of thousands of poor peoples to do yeoman's share of canal construction badly exacerbated the overcrowding and substandard living conditions in working-class neighborhoods of Panama City and Colón. Significant changes did occur, though the merit mentioning there, the huge population of urban poor gradually developed a collective class consciousness that made their demands and protestations much more newly significant. In the late 1910s through the 1920s, various unions took shape in the working-class neighborhoods, adding much-needed focus to the breadth of Panama's urban poor. Eventually, these unions worked to ensure that Panama's workers would have a voice in the nation's government, and this was particularly true in the 1970s, when the regime of General Omar Torrijos co-opted the urban worker into a broad-based popular political front for effective change in Panama's political and economic elite. Also in 1910, 1920s, and 1930s, Panama's middle class grew rapidly because of the canal, greatly expanded the need for Panama's service sector economy. This expanding middle class split over the issue of vast American presence in their homeland. Merchants and others whose fortunes hinged on American presence favored accommodating American interests. The concerns group Panamans known as ruddy blancos or whitetails, derogatory phrase in Panama to use wealthy and middle-class Panamanians who favor the American presence because it brought them money. Conversely, various groups of white-collar professionals formed the corps of a nationalist anti-American black voice who grew increasingly influential in the 1930s. The nationalists grew in influence as 1935 with President Armando Arias founded the Universidad de Panama to preserve the Panamanian nationality. Civil disobedience. Beginning in the 1940s, civil and political organizations grew among Panama's poor, and its expanding middle class came increasingly to jeopardize elite interests. Beginning in the 1930s during Roosevelt's Good Neighbor program, presidents had taken steps to modernize Panama's police and make it formidable so that it could effectively reckon with civil disobedience and political opposition. Consequently, when public protests and political gatherings became more common in the 1940s, Panama's governing elite used armed intimidation to quell their policies exactly as Somoza, Nicaragua, Caracas in Honduras, and Hernan Martinez in El Salvador, and Ubico in Guatemala. Relations between Panama's ruling oligarchy and the rest of the nation's population had a definite boiling point in December 1947. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, Panama granted the United States to occupy 134 bases outside the canal zone to more effectively defend approaches to the canal. Approximately 60,000 American soldiers occupied all of Panama for the duration of the war. Given the circumstances, Panamanians generally tolerated the imposition. They had witnessed at Pearl Harbor what could happen during an enemy attack. So opposition to the expanded military presence remained muted until the end of the war. At war's end, politicians in Panama City and Washington dragged their feet and did not comply with the terminal clause of the treaty, which required U.S. forces to abandon these 134 bases. American officials had no intention of complying with this last clause of accord. In the last days of September 1946, American officials petitioned permission from Panama to remain those additional sites, and the Panamanian government officials took under consideration setting off a storm of popular protests across the isthmus. Panama's president, Enrique Jimenez, sum of money invested in Panama's beef industry, and the commander of Panama's National Police, Jose Antonio Ramon Cantera, also had a significant investment in the nation's beef industry. Both Jimenez and Ramon stood a lot of money if the troops withdrew. Secretly, two sides considered faking a withdrawal, after which Panama's government would request urgent thus placating the opposition without losing any money. At issue here was not a Panamanian president who could disregard wide popular opposition as long as he had police support. On December 10, 1947, the Panamanian government approved the Philos-Hines Treaty, which allowed the U.S. forces to remain on 134 bases despite unprecedented opposition. Over the course of the next few weeks, a series of pitched battles occurred between the tens of thousands of Panamanian city protesters and Ramon's police, who shot indiscriminately into the crowds in efforts to disperse the protesters. Jimenez's Harvey-heartedness and naked greed accomplished something that years of union activity and political activism had: the government's glaring disregard for its constitution and ruthlessness. The police bound together desperate groups of protesters who suddenly had all the same objectives. The reversal of the Philos-Hines provide a rallying cry for the tens of thousands Panamanians embraced. The result was stunning. On December 22, 1947, Panama's Legislative Assembly voted unanimously to end the Philos-Hines Treaty and required American troops to evacuate 134 sites among the Canal Zone. The Philos-Hines marked a turning point in modern Panamanian history, and for the first time massive cohesive protests had prevented Panama's governing elite from legislating in the face of popular opposition. Unquestionably, the showdown over the base issue marked a significant victory for Panamanian nationalists, including students, civic groups, women's organizations, political parties, and labor unions. In the long run, however, the confrontation over the bases 'also strengthened the role of national police, believing the opposition to have been Believing the opposition had been communist-motivated and directed from Moscow, Commander Ramon accelerated the professionalism of the National Police, which quickly emerged as the most powerful arbitrator in the Isthmus. In one brief period, in 1949, Ramon greatly intimidated the nation's electoral board into changing its findings. In Ramon's watchful eye, Panama had 3 interim presidents in 5 days. Ramon, the police commander, had become Ramon the Kingmaker. In 1952, Ramon left the police and ran successfully for president. He changed the name from National Police to National Guard and took a number of steps to improve the standard of living for the nation's armed forces. He hired among minorities, sometimes previously incompetent, built a modern Competencia police headquarters in the Panama City working-class neighborhoods of El Codillo. The new Competencia, same building destroyed in 1889, mentioning the garden was still headquartered there when troops could purchase goods at the reduced prices. Ramon was assassinated in 1955 while attending a horse race on the outskirts of Panama City. However, his legacy lives on. Ramon was Panama's first 20th-century military dictator. After his assassination, his successor assumed a less prominent role in the military affairs. For 13 years, the National Guard remained its barracks. In 1968, the calm was broken when Alfredo Arias became president of Panama. Immediately after he took office on October 1st, Arias began forcibly retiring military officers and generally meddling in the affairs of the National Guard, something he vowed he would not do. 10 days later, while Arias was viewing a movie in downtown cinema, officers of the National Guard occupied the palace, cut off television and radio stations, and ousted Arias. On a return of events, he sought asylum.